Hello, good morning. It's Thursday, June the 4th. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's. And let's start with a mystery. This morning, we read that on the day of Peter Mandelson's sacking, the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, Darren Jones, sent him a message saying he was sorry and what a great job he'd done as ambassador. But why has that surfaced now? And might the Dark Lord himself have anything to do with it? My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Well, let's look at the evidence, because this missive was revealed by The Spectator's Tim Shipman, but it wasn't in Monday's Mandelson Files document dump. Darren Jones told the Commons his messages were no longer available, and it's not in his interest to see something as embarrassing as that surface again. And Peter Mandelson didn't, as it said in the documents, hand over his phone to the government. But could the peer be doing a little bit of political spinning from beyond the political grave? Who could possibly say? It is, as you mentioned, Anne, a mystery.
It's Thursday, the last day of the parliamentary week, and a story from outside Westminster has been driving a hard political conversation. And that is the dreadful tale of the stabbing of Henry Nowak, a student in Southampton last December, his subsequent treatment by police and his death, and the police body cam footage, which showed the 18-year-old being handcuffed by officers after he'd been stabbed because the perpetrator had falsely accused him of racism. Well, that has led this week to protests and to street clashes and an ongoing divide about what the story really tells us. More about that in a moment.
Yeah, and to be honest, attention in Westminster, bluntly, pretty much every conversation I'm having at the moment is going on also about stuff that's happening outside Westminster. In particular, what on earth is going on in Makerfield at the by-election and in terms of succession planning? What is Andy Burnham doing and preparing? So a change of Prime Minister could be anything from 3 weeks to 3 months away. 3 months if it's a contest, but 3 weeks if it's I've been calling it a coronation, Anne, but one of our listeners, Robert, actually got in touch to say we should be calling it a conclave. As a better word, because it's a behind closed doors decision by a selectorate who don't want a broader democratic input into the decision and don't want their dirty laundry and arguments happening in public. And I have to say, I rather thought Robert has a point. Anyway, I'm going to go to Manchester early next week myself to take the temperature from much closer to the action, because it seems that everything is happening up there. But there's an awful lot of just worrying in sort of corridors in Westminster about who's there, who's in, who's out, and what's being planned.
And the question beginning to loom into view as we head to a possible Labour papal conclave is what a Burnham-led future might look like in the detail, because so far it's been a one-man show, inevitably, because his route is via a by-election and he has to be the figure there in the limelight, and particularly to show that he has the local chops for the job. But in plain sight, Sam, is the fact that this is a preparatory step to national power. One of the accusations that's been persistent against Team Keir is that they came into office unprepared. Well, that's a question now being fired at the Burnham Brigade. If you're serious about power, what are you doing to prepare for it?
Yeah, in my chats with people, there's a bit of worry about that, if I'm being honest. I talked to one person who was quite intimately involved with a couple of decisions around and involving Andy Burnham, I don't know, about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago. And one observation they made was that there are too many cooks, that to get something done, there's sort of 6-7 people you need to get through. But the candidate himself, Andy Burnham, just does do what he says he's doing. He's out knocking doors all day long, as his social media presence suggests. And so there isn't a huge amount of time in order to sort of pin him down on some of the biggest issues and this command structure on the ground up there when it comes to planning for government, as well as and a leadership campaign, as well as the by-election, is just a little bit unclear. One person who has also had contact with Team Burnham said, as an aside, Andy's just given too many jobs to too many people. Now, I'm sure Team Andy would deny that, but that's the perception down here. And that's jobs in the sense of maybe future cabinet posts, although I'm sure, again, he would say nothing's been handed out, but people are starting to come away with impressions. There does seem to be indirect reporting lines on the team up there. There are MPs involved in the campaign. They're bringing in their staff or sort of allies of them to try and sort stuff out. There seem to be allies of Sue Gray now on the ground in Makerfield as well. And I'm told that the Baroness is involved in some of the planning and making calls in the last few days to people in Westminster and Whitehall about what should happen next. And there were stories at the weekend about her involvement. My understanding is that that's true and that's active, even though sources say that she won't have a formal role with the Burnham government if that happens. So given that it's all moving quite fast, there's only a month between the by-election date and recess in mid-July. And if it doesn't happen in that period, everything pauses until the autumn. That you're right. The question is there enough of a plan?
It sounds like one of those very ad hoc transition teams that they have in the US, which have scores of people and masses of documents. But this is in a very British way. This looks like it's having to be cobbled together. And if he does win the by-election, Andy Burnham has a huge task, doesn't he? He has to present a plan to the country and to the party that can justify him taking over in these slightly bizarre circumstances as Prime Minister. Now, right now, all of that comes with such a lot of political and policy constraints because, in essence, we are still in the Keir era. So those manifesto pledges and also promises and exclusions that the Starmer administration have made still stand. But there's going to be a change, and everybody knows there's going to be a change. The difficulty is how to work out what should happen by what point, and or what some might just look too presumptuous. And I think that's another reason why maybe you're getting these kind of shadow teams working away, but they can't really align, can they? Because otherwise it would look like they were in the middle of a massive plot even before he's in Parliament.
Yeah, but there has to be work. And I was talking to one Andy Burnham sort of helper, and I was asking, what on earth can you do that's big and bold enough that nevertheless doesn't trip over the red lines and constraints that you've imposed on yourself already just in the last couple of weeks? And they said, actually, there's more than you might realise that you can do. They said, even if you carry over Rachel Reeves' exact fiscal rules, which Team Burnham have suggested that they will, although the markets want a bit more clarity on that. They said that even if you do that, there's more scope for targeted borrowing than she's exercising at the moment. And there's a particular plan that they floated on maybe a big publicly funded social housing program. So what you can do under the redrawn debt rules, remember she changed them in 2024 to what was known as PSNUFL, a sort of technical way of measuring debt against the fiscal rules, is you could do a big public building program funded by borrowing, provided that the government then takes a stake in the project. And then that means it doesn't sort of sit in the balance sheet of the government in quite the same way and would no longer count against the fiscal rules. So a big government-funded housing program is possible, they believe, and that would be very much in line with the Burnham rhetoric on the doorstep right now. The Treasury, under the current administration, has resisted something like that. I think even though the Communities Department under Angela Rayner certainly wanted it. But could this clear the way? It would mean more borrowing, but it would be within the rules. Is that the kind of big thing that Andy Burnham could come out of the traps and promise in the event that when we finally get to questions around how he would be Prime Minister?
That's intriguing, and that would be bold. Certainly, one thing that's implicit in that, which perhaps people don't talk about enough when we talk about the possible replacing of Keir Starmer, is I suspect that's would mean also a new Chancellor, because Rachel Reeves hasn't done that. She's opted, or she and Starmer opted not to do that kind of thing. So I think you would have to say it would probably be a new start also in number 11 as well, which throws up the obvious question of who it would be. it is complicated because what you're describing there is, and I hadn't actually heard that idea before, and I think it's one to bookmark, but it means that you've got to have a kind of shadow treasury sort of role going on at the moment, or thinking going on, and you can't afford to miscalculate, because starting off a new Burnham push for power with some problem on the side of the figures would be difficult. So as you're suggesting, Sam, it needs to be something that wouldn't clash with the existing fiscal rules. Be interesting when he shows up tonight on Question Time from Makerfield on the BBC, how much of a sense of national promise does Burnham give, as well as touting his by-election credentials, because it is, Makerfield, it is really maker or breaker field, isn't it, for the Burnham offensive?
I think we have to credit Laura Koonsberg with maker or breaker field.
I had
She was
no
the first person I
idea,
heard.
in my defense.
Okay.
I really didn't. Oh, right. Okay.
No.
Damn. That was me thinking I had my early morning humour hat
Laura
on.
and Anne.
Hi, Laura. Well done.
But listen, you raised the question of shadowing Chancellor and the Treasury stuff. When Andy Burnham clarified his position on fiscal rules, I'm told that Ed Miliband was involved in that decision. And I think that led to a lot of speculation that could Ed Miliband end up as being Chancellor. But even now I'm hearing maybe, but at the same time, there's a recognition that you might need to get a Chancellor from the other sort of bit of the other wing of Labour, effectively. You can't have two people on the soft left at the top of the party just to balance the ticket out. So that takes us down to the kind of, you were talking about Streeting, I was talking about Shabana Mahmood. We honestly don't know, but I get that sense from people who are involved that there is a sort of balancing ticket. Listen, I've picked up another problem, bluntly, with all of this shadow policy making, which is, and this comes from somebody who's following it all very closely. Andy Burnham's team are having, by necessity, to work in the dark, specifically without any help from the civil service, right? The two most comparable recent times where a prime minister was on their way out, so Theresa May in 2019, Boris Johnson in 2022, the PM resigned, right? And when the PM resigns ahead of a leadership contest, that triggers the ability for access talks to take place. So the cabinet secretary, in this case, Antonio Romeo, previously Simon Case, was allowed candidates to come in and check their numbers, their costings, do a reality check on any ideas that, were being run before the selectorate at that point. But because Keir Starmer's not acknowledged he's going anywhere, all of the teams around Burnham are having to draw up policies in the dark without any help from civil servants who can quietly go, well, of course that won't work. Meaning that if there's a conclave, an immediate transition, his team will perhaps unfairly be more on the back foot than comparable recent episodes.
Yeah, I guess, but he did choose to challenge the Prime Minister, stand in a by-election to force his way back to Parliament. So it's not going to be an orthodox path to power, is it? But I think what you're right to point out is it comes with huge opportunity for Andy Burnham, but a lot of pitfalls as well that he has to step around in order to look like he's prepared. But he has the constraints that you have wrinkled out there. Let's talk about that other big story that is roiling Westminster, and that is the impact of the murder of Henry Nowak. Now, that has moved from anger about the circumstances of this young man's death just before Christmas to an apology already by Hampshire Police for the fact that he was handcuffed on the ground after he had been assaulted and fatally, as it turned out. And that's moved then to accusations, essentially, that the police believed the man who stabbed him, his murderer, on grounds of racism, because the man was alleging that the argument, the quarrel that the two had on that night out had then turned into racism. That was then proved not to have been the case. Well, it was a quieter night last night after clashes the night before by protesters and some attacks on the police trying to control that in Southampton. But the story's now moved pretty fast, hasn't it, to a question of whether officers felt that they were controlled or pressured by diversity initiatives, which had emphasised the need to be more alert to racism. The former Home Secretary, Jack Straw, weighing in there on that, saying that he thought this had gone too far. This will be, I think, a big story tonight when we see what the candidates, or most of the main candidates in Makerfield, are going to say about that case on Question Time. There's a lot of pressure there on also Nigel Farage really going with the story at Westminster. He too, however, getting pressure from his right flank, from Restore on this as well. It's very fissile political material, isn't it?
It really is. So what is the broad political response, the nature of the kind of the nature of the response? Well, we had a sense of that yesterday, and we'll see that again this evening. And really it breaks down into two categories, I thought. There's Nigel Farage and the rest. That's certainly what we saw at PMQs yesterday. So Nigel Farage has talked about his cold rage, and he has been laying out why what we've seen is evidence of two-tier policing. The other party leaders, well, they were very consciously seeking to dial down the rhetoric. So interestingly, this included Kemi Badenoch, whose tone was much closer in the Commons chamber to Keir Starmer than to Nigel Farage, even though the Tories have unearthed guidance on race and been talking about all lives mattering and are not shying away from it. But Kemi Badenoch was very clear that she wanted to emphasise responsibility and bringing people together, and didn't make this the main subject of PMQs yesterday. And so I felt that that was the first time I felt that the coalitions around a subject were not right and left, but everyone versus Farage in the Commons chamber. And you heard the kind of barracking of him. Now, I wonder whether he thinks that works in his advantage. I think others felt that this was an emotive issue, and he was dishonouring the families by talking in the manner that he did. We will see more on that this evening on Question Time. Terms and conditions. Andy Burnham will be on Question Time as a Makerfield candidate. The names of all the other candidates in the Makerfield by-election are in the show notes of this podcast. What will Andy Burnham say? Well, we got a bit of a clue. He has done a social media post on this, saying that he talked to the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police and would lay out a fuller response today. And in a couple of short paragraphs, he sort of sounded like he was echoing the Starmer response, that the family's wish was not to turn this into political football and that should be respected, with all of the implicit rebuke of Nigel Farage and reform that comes with that. But more broadly, there is that sense that I think you believe that, Keir Starmer maybe didn't find the right gears after the Southport incident. I think Labour MPs are lining up behind Andy Burnham precisely because he's good at seizing moments like this. This is the sweet spot that he is presumed to be able to hit. He managed it after the Manchester bombing, arena bombing. He managed it during COVID. That's when he became King of the North. He has an instinctive ability and is meant to have a really good way with words. And we have seen that in the past. He sort of summons the lifelong Catholic in him. There's something of the sort of red-blooded preacher about his style, and he can sort of turn it on from seemingly from nowhere. So I am really interested to see whether he rises to the moment, and then I don't know how it's going to play in the by-election, but that's why I think today matters in that context.
Yeah, it's a really good point, isn't it? Can you find an emotional register when there is this sort of tragedy, and it really wakes up the nation, and very easily these days then can turn very quickly into bitterness and divisions? Can you find an emotional response to that, which I think Keir Starmer, it would be fair to say, has struggled with both after Southport in 2024 and occasionally at other times, without then going into the territory where you make matters worse and that people just feel more stirred up and divided than united? It is quite a challenge, but Andy Burnham does have something of that in his skill set. So what do we get? Do we get red-blooded preacher, which is from the evangelical tradition, Sam Coates, or do we get something sort of more reflective from Andy Burnham? But it has to carry, hasn't it? People have to listen to it and think, yeah, he has captured something that I feel.
And that goes to the heart of whether or not Labour can take on reform nationally, whether or not the Burnham project works. There's two different styles of trying to appeal to the public, and it's about who taps into emotion better, Andy Burnham or Nigel Farage. You're talking about emotional responses and just how evocative people can be. I've got a little one for you on a different subject. Yesterday we talked about Palantir, and I was highlighting that on social media on X. And Piers Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn's brother, jumped in with a video to reply to my Palantir tweet. And he's done a song poem about why Palantir shouldn't really be allowed in the to be used by the British government. It's quite the most surreal thing I've seen in a while. But if you have a song video that you want to send us in response to one of our points, feel free. If evangelizing is the name of the game today, then we need to evangelize about our 20-minute limit, which is up. And do you have a song about that?
No, I don't. I was just thinking if a member of the Corbyn family weighed in to support Palantir, we should definitely put that at the top of the podcast next time. I must have a look at that. Let's everybody have a look at that song poem.
Brilliant. Well, all eyes on North, I think, over the next few days. I'll be with you probably from Manchester on Monday morning or certainly going up there then. So I will see you then.
I'll see you from Manchester on Monday.